It was 2:17 the morning when my phone lit up the dark. I'd been awake anyway. 30 years in the army had rewired something in my brain that never quite reset, even 8 years after my last deployment. I lay in the same position I'd fallen asleep in, staring at the ceiling, listening to the kind of silence that only exists in the hours before dawn when the whole world seems to hold its breath. The number on the screen was my daughter's. My chest tightened before I even answered. Parents know. Something animal in us recognizes the frequency of disaster before logic catches up. Dad. Her voice was wrong, compressed, like she was speaking through a fist closing around her throat. Rachel, what happened? Not a question. A door swinging open. I'm outside. I didn't know where else to go. I was already moving. Down the hall, down the stairs, bare feet on cold hardwood. My hand found the porch light before I reached the door. The bolt turned. The door opened. She stood on my front steps in the October dark, wearing the same cream-colored blouse she'd had on at her school's open house 3 days ago. I knew because she'd sent me a photo. Proud teacher at her classroom door. That blouse was torn at the left shoulder now, hanging loose. Her bottom lip was split and swollen. The right side of her jaw carried a bruise that hadn't fully risen yet, still that early red-purple that I recognized from my years patching up men in the field, the kind that would look far worse by morning. She reached for me, and I caught her. "Come inside," I said. Nothing else. My voice came out level the way it had been trained to, which was the only mercy I could offer her in that moment, because everything underneath it was anything but level. I brought her to the kitchen, the way you always bring people to kitchens in moments like this, because kitchens are the rooms that feel most like survival. I sat her down at the table under the overhead light, the one my wife had picked out 20 years ago and that I'd never changed even after she passed. Because some things you keep. I looked at my daughter. Really looked. The bruise on her jaw was 1 point of damage. There was also a red mark along her left forearm, the kind that comes from fingers gripping too hard. A scrape above her left eyebrow. When she reached for the glass of water I set in front of her, her hand shook. "We're going to the hospital," I said. "Dad, it's not that serious. I just need to—" "That's not a question." I kept my voice quiet. "You need to be examined and documented. Every mark. Professionally. That matters later. Drink some water first." She drank. I moved around the kitchen, getting what I needed, my phone for photos before we left. A light jacket from the closet because she was shivering. My car keys from the hook by the back door. "Tell me what happened," I said, sitting across from her. "Take your time." She told me. My son-in-law had come home late. Again. This had been the pattern for months. Rachel had found something on his phone 2 weeks ago, she said. A name. Conversations that didn't belong in a marriage. She'd confronted him that night, and he'd denied everything with the particular viciousness of someone caught, then somehow made her feel guilty for checking. She'd let it go because she always let it go, because that was what 8 years of slow erosion does to a person. It teaches them that their own perceptions are suspect. But tonight she'd found a receipt. Hotel, downtown Dallas. 2 nights ago, the same 2 nights he'd told her he was in Houston for work. She'd confronted him again. He'd told her she was paranoid, pathetic, that she'd driven him to it by being exactly what he'd told her to stop. She hadn't been able to. He'd grabbed her by the arm, that explained the marks, and when she'd pulled away, he'd hit her across the face with an open hand. Open hand. Like that made it something other than what it was. She'd fallen into the wall. He'd stood over her and told her that if she called anyone, if she caused any trouble, he would make sure she lost everything. The house, her reputation. He had lawyers, he'd said. He had money. She had a teacher's salary and a father who was nobody. She'd waited until she heard him in the shower. Then she'd taken her purse and her keys, and she'd driven for 40 minutes before she'd thought to call me. I took photographs before we left. Her face, her arm, the scrape above her eye. I made her stand in the kitchen light, and I documented every injury with the same methodical detachment that I'd learned 3 decades ago. Because when you're in the field, when things are at their worst, you do not have the luxury of falling apart. You complete the task. You carry your feelings in a locked box until there is time to open it. The locked box was getting heavy. We drove to the hospital. The night shift doctor was a young woman who treated Rachel with a gentleness that nearly undid me. She documented everything, photographed everything, asked Rachel the questions in the practiced, careful way of someone trained to do exactly this. Rachel answered them in a voice that got steadier as the examination went on, as if saying the words out loud to a professional was making them real in a way they hadn't been before. We left the hospital at 4:45 inches the morning with paperwork, with documentation, with the name of a victim's advocate, and with the kind of clarity that comes from a thing being witnessed. In the car on the way back to my house, Rachel was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I should have left a long time ago." I kept my eyes on the road. "Yes," I said, "you should have." Because the truth is, I had seen this coming. Not all of it. Not the specific night, the specific hotel receipt, the specific moment a man raised his hand to my daughter. But I had seen the shape of what was building, and I had looked away. I had found reasons, excuses. The particular cowardice of a man who loves his daughter so much that he'd rather believe everything is fine than face the alternative. The first time I noticed something wrong was at their wedding. 5 years ago, a hall in Plano on a Saturday afternoon in September, warm enough that the women were fanning themselves with their programs. Rachel had looked beautiful in a way that made my chest ache because her mother should have been there to see it and wasn't. She'd walked toward me at the end of the aisle, and I'd been the one crying, and she'd laughed and said, "Dad, you're embarrassing me," and I'd said, "I know, I don't care." During the ceremony, I'd watched her husband-to-be. He was polished, good-looking in that aggressively maintained way, not a hair or a cuff out of place. He gave his vows with a confidence that the crowd responded to, nodding, smiling. He looked like the right answer, but during the reception, small things. When Rachel stood to give a toast, he put his hand over hers on the microphone and said, "Let me," with a smile that the room received as charming. She sat down. Her smile didn't change, but her eyes did, just briefly, something dimming there before she reassembled the expression. Later, during the father-daughter dance, the DJ played the song she'd picked out, the same one her mother and I had danced to, and for a few measures it was just the two of us, turning slowly, under the lights the way we had when she was 7, and standing on my feet in the living room. "Dad," she said quietly, close to my ear. "Yeah, sweetheart." A pause. We turned. The lights moved around us. "He gets so angry sometimes," she said, "over nothing. And then it passes, and he's wonderful again, and I think I imagined it. Every instinct I had said, 'Stop. Listen. This is her asking you something important.'" I pulled back and looked at her. Her expression was careful, measuring, waiting to see what I would do with what she'd just handed me. And I said, "All couples go through adjustments the first year. He's under a lot of pressure with the new firm. Give it time." Her face settled back into something neutral. "You're right," she said. "I know." The song ended. We separated. Her husband appeared immediately, hand at the small of her back, and I watched her posture shift, just slightly, into something more careful and contained. I told myself it was my imagination. The second time was Easter, 18 months into the marriage. We drove out to my brother's place in Fort Worth for the family gathering, the whole extended mess of us, cousins and their kids, and my brother's 2 dogs that couldn't be in the same room without escalating. Rachel and her husband arrived an hour late. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. During dinner, her husband corrected her twice. Once about a story she was telling about one of her students, interrupting to say, "That's not how you told it before," with the pleasant, patient tone of a man explaining something obvious. The second time was when she said she was thinking of going back for her master's degree in education, and he said, again pleasantly, that they'd discussed the timing on that, and maybe they should revisit before she told the whole family. She went quiet. She passed the rolls. She smiled at something my niece said. After dinner, I found her alone in my brother's kitchen, standing at the window with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. "You okay?" I asked. "Fine." Automatic. Then, after a moment, "He's just been stressed lately." "What kind of stressed?" She turned from the window and looked at me with an expression I didn't know how to read then, though I understand it now. It was the look of a person standing at the edge of something and deciding not to jump. "Work stuff." "It's fine, Dad. He's fine." I nodded. I believed her because I wanted to. I told myself she was an adult who knew her own marriage. I told myself that I was reading too much into the cadence of a dinner conversation. I drove home from Fort Worth, and I didn't bring it up again. The third time was winter, 2.5 years ago. Rachel called me on a Tuesday afternoon when she should have been at school, and her voice had that compressed quality again, the one I hadn't recognized yet for what it was. She said she'd taken a personal day. She said she was fine. She said she just needed to talk. We met for coffee at a place near her school, a diner with red vinyl booths and coffee that came in mugs the size of your head. She was already there when I arrived. She had a long-sleeved shirt on, despite the fact that it was one of those warm Texas winter days that feel almost like April. We talked around things for a while. Her students, my neighbor's ongoing war with a particular family of squirrels, the normal conversational scaffolding you construct when you're building towards something difficult. Then I asked how things were at home. She looked at her coffee mug. "We had a fight last week," she said. "A bad one." He said some things. "What kind of things?" "Things about me, who I am, what I'm worth." Her jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter," he apologized. "He always apologizes." "He always?" I asked, which meant it had happened more than once, more than twice, which meant always was the word she'd reached for without thinking. She heard herself and looked up quickly. It's not like that. He has a temper. It's not physical. He would never." She stopped, reconsidered. "We're working on it." "Rachel." "Dad, please don't. I'm your father." "I know," she met my eyes. "And I'm asking you, as my father, to trust me to handle my own marriage. I'm not a soldier in your unit. I'm allowed to make my own decisions." That landed exactly where she intended it to. 30 years of commanding men had given me an authority that could become its own kind of control, and she knew it and she used it, and I let her. I drove home. I turned her words over in my mind for weeks. I told myself she'd said he wasn't physical. I told myself she'd said they were working on it. I told myself the most damaging lie a loving parent can tell. She'll come to me when she's ready. The fourth time was a year ago last March. Her husband and I had agreed to meet at a steakhouse near his office. His suggestion, which I should have read more carefully at the time. It was the first time we'd been alone together in nearly a year, and within 10 minutes I understood why he'd arranged it. He spent the first part of the meal being the version of himself he performed for audiences. Charming, successful, the right jokes. Then, over the entrees, he shifted. He said that he was concerned about me. That Rachel had mentioned I'd been calling her frequently, sometimes multiple times a week, and that she found it overwhelming but didn't want to hurt my feelings by saying so. He said it was natural for a widower to become overly dependent on an only child. He said he was telling me as a friend. I looked at him across the table. In my 30 years of service, I had met many different kinds of dangerous men. Some of them looked the part. Some of them looked exactly like the man sitting across from me. Tailored shirt, easy smile, cutting off access routes disguised as concern. "I appreciate you telling me," I said. He nodded, satisfied. I drove home, and I called Rachel. She answered on the second ring, warm and normal. She said nothing about feeling overwhelmed by my calls. I didn't tell her about the dinner. I told myself I didn't have enough to go on. I told myself she would resent me for interfering. I told myself a lot of things. I had been a soldier for 30 years. I had made decisions in places where hesitation cost lives. And sitting at my kitchen table after that dinner, I'd hesitated, not from lack of courage, from love. The particular paralysis of loving someone so much that you'd rather do nothing than do the wrong thing. It is a cowardice dressed up as respect, and I will live with it for the rest of my life. Now it was 5:30 the morning, and my daughter was asleep on the couch in my living room under the same blue quilt her mother had made. And the locked box I'd been carrying all night was pressing against my ribs from the inside. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, and I wrote everything down. Timeline, injuries, names, dates, the hotel receipt. The prior incidents Rachel had described in the car, the pattern of the past 8 years condensed into a chronology that, written out in order, made the shape of what had been happening absolutely clear. I had done this before, in different contexts, for different reasons. The instinct for documentation was trained into me, and I was grateful for it now. I wrote, Incident, October 14th, Rachel Marie Haynes, victim, Marcus Haynes, subject. And then I stopped writing and put the pen down and sat there for a moment with my hands flat on the table. My son-in-law had hit my daughter. I'd been holding the professional distance across all of it. The drive, the hospital, the drive back, sitting with her while she talked, making sure everything was recorded properly. The distance had served its purpose. Now I let it go. The anger was cold. That's what people don't understand. They expect hot rage, explosive, loud. What I felt was cold and very clear and very old. The specific temperature of a man who has spent decades learning the difference between a reaction and a response. I picked the pen back up and kept writing. By 6:15, I had called Dale. Dale Crawford had been my commanding officer for the last 8 years of my service. He'd retired 5 years before I did and had gone into private consulting, which was a clean way of saying he knew everybody and was owed favors by half of them. He also had a younger brother who'd been a Dallas County Sheriff's detective for 20 years and was currently a supervising officer. The phone rang 4 times. Frank, his voice was already awake. Dale had never slept well either. I need help, I said. It's Rachel. A pause. When he spoke again, the casual tone was gone entirely. Tell me, I told him, briefly, specifically, the way we'd always communicated, no extra words. By the time I finished, I could hear him thinking. Kevin's shift starts at 7, he said. Kevin was the brother. I'll reach him before he gets in. You have documentation? Photos from the scene, hospital records, written statement. I've started a timeline. Good man. Do not go near the husband. I mean that, Frank. I know. Say it back to me. I won't go near him. Because you're thinking about it. I'm thinking about a lot of things, I said. I'm going to do this the right way. A brief pause. I know you are. That's why I'm helping you. Give me 30 minutes. I ended the call and went to the small bedroom at the end of the hall that I'd been using as a study since Rachel left home 10 years ago. One wall was shelving. On the bottom shelf, in the back corner, a garment bag. I hadn't opened it in years. I'd thought about getting rid of it more than once, but there are things you keep not because you expect to use them again, but because they represent something you don't want to let go of entirely. I unzipped the bag. My dress uniform, Army service uniform, Class A, the one I'd worn to every formal occasion in the last decade of my service, the one I'd worn to my wife's funeral because she'd asked me to, years before she got sick. She'd said when I go, I want to see you in it one last time. Dark blue fabric. The brass was still polished. The ribbons in their precise order. The rank insignia on the collar. I lifted it out and stood with it in my hands. In the window's reflection, I saw myself. 62 years old, gray at the temples, more lines than I'd been issued, broader across the chest than when the uniform was made, but not so much that it wouldn't fit. I looked like a man who had been somewhere and come back, whatever that was worth. I put it on, shirt first, then the pants, the belt, the jacket, buttoned precisely, the ribbons across my chest, 30 years of places and decisions. I stood straight the way the uniform required, the way the spine remembers, even when the rest of you is uncertain. The man in the window looked like someone capable of finishing what he'd started. I went back to the kitchen, made coffee, and waited. Rachel woke up at 7:30. She came to the kitchen doorway, still wrapped in the quilt, hair loose. The bruise on her jaw darkened overnight to the purple-black I'd expected. She stopped when she saw the uniform. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition. Dad, she said quietly. How do you feel? She considered this honestly. Like I got hit. You did get hit. I poured her coffee. Rachel, I need you to do something today that's going to be hard. She sat down across from me. A formal report, with Kevin Crawford, Dale's brother. He's one of the good ones. He'll treat you right. She wrapped both hands around the mug. Outside the kitchen window, the October morning was coming in clear and cold, the kind of light that makes everything look very clean and specific. He said he'd take everything, she said. If I made trouble, the house, the accounts. He has lawyers, So does he now, I said. Kevin knows a prosecutor named Angela Marsh who handles domestic violence cases specifically. She's been doing it for 15 years. You are not the first person to hear the speech about lawyers and money and losing everything. I paused. He's betting that fear keeps you quiet. It has before. It won't this time. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her hands around the mug. I should have come to you the first time, she said. The first time he screamed at me. 3 months after the wedding. I was so ashamed. I should have pushed harder at Easter, I said. At the diner, at the wedding even. I saw things, and I let myself believe what was easier. She looked up. I failed you, I said. Not today. Before today, I won't fail you again. Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together hard, the way she'd done since she was small when she was determined not to cry. Okay, she said finally. Let's do this. We met Kevin Crawford at the county administration building at 9 that morning. He was a compact, careful man in his mid-50s. Dale's coloring, the same quality of presence that says, I've seen things, and they haven't broken me. He shook Rachel's hand before he shook mine, which I noted. He directed his first questions to her, not to me, which I also noted. He was good at this. Rachel gave her statement at a table in a room with a box of tissues and a pitcher of water. I sat beside her, but I didn't speak. This was her account, hers to give, in her own words, in her own sequence. I watched her find the voice she'd used in the hospital exam room the night before, the one that got steadier as it went on, and I was aware of something that might have been pride if there were any room for it among everything else. She documented 8 years. The escalation, the specific incidents, the pattern of isolation. She'd been pulled away from her 2 closest friends, from me, gradually and methodically. The control of the finances. She'd had her own account, and then somehow she didn't. The money moved to joint accounts he managed. The criticisms, the anger that arrived without warning and departed with apology, leaving her perpetually uncertain about which version of reality was true. And then, finally, last night, the receipt, the confrontation, his hand across her face. Kevin took everything down. Angela Marsh joined them after the statement to discuss next steps. She was exactly what I'd been told, direct, experienced, with the particular quality of someone who has spent 15 years refusing to be discouraged. You have a strong case, she said to Rachel. Not to me. Physical documentation, medical records, a pattern of documented behavior once we pull financials. He is going to use the playbook. Money, intimidation, delay. We've seen it 100 times. A pause. We know how to deal with it. We left the building at noon. I drove. Rachel was quiet in the passenger seat, looking out at the city moving past. I feel like I've been carrying something very heavy, she said, and I put it down, and now my arms don't know what to do. They'll figure it out. She almost smiled. The arrest happened that afternoon. I was not there for it. That was not my role, and I understood it. Kevin's team went to the financial firm where my son-in-law worked, at Angela Marsh's recommendation, because a public location tends to accelerate the decision to cooperate. He was brought in for questioning. His lawyer arrived within 40 minutes, which told you something about how prepared he'd been for the possibility. Kevin called me at 4:30. He's been charged, he said. Domestic battery, assault. The prior incidents Rachel described give us grounds to request a higher bond. The judge agreed. He'll be in until arraignment tomorrow at the earliest. I sat down at my kitchen table. Through the doorway, I could see Rachel in the living room with her phone, calling her friend, the one she'd been slowly separated from, speaking in the low, urgent voice of someone returning from somewhere they'd been gone too long. Thank you, I said. I never had much use for men who hit women, Kevin said, which was the plainest and most complete thing he could have said. The courthouse was on a gray December morning 3 months later, the kind of day that Dallas does sometimes, low clouds and cold that has no manners. Rachel wore a dark blazer and her hair back. She looked like herself, the self she'd been before, the teacher, the woman who laughed easily and had opinions about everything and took up space without apology. It had taken 3 months to start getting that person back, And she wasn't all the way back yet, but she was moving in the right direction, which was more than she'd been able to say in years. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table. Kevin was there in his dress uniform. I'd noticed he'd dressed deliberately, and Rachel's friend sat on my other side, having driven from Austin the night before without being asked twice. My son-in-law was at the defendant's table with 2 lawyers. He'd lost weight. He looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was finally seeing him clearly, after years of the image I'd been given by my own reluctance to look. His suit was expensive and pressed, and everything about him said this is a serious man who should be taken seriously, the same performance I'd been watching for 8 years. Angela Marsh called Rachel to the stand. She walked up there with the same steadiness she'd had in Kevin's interview room. She took the oath. She sat down. She found Angela's eyes, and then she told the truth. She told all of it. The early months of marriage, when she'd first understood that the anger was not something that would resolve with time. The isolation, friends first, then family. The calls to me that she'd started filtering because he made her feel that her need for outside connection was a kind of infidelity. The financial control, the diminishment that happened so gradually she hadn't noticed until one day she realized she'd stopped having opinions out loud. And then the escalation. The night she'd found the hotel receipt, the confrontation, the hand across her face. She was on the stand for 90 minutes. The defense lawyer tried several angles. Rachel held her ground every time. When she stepped down, she came back to the seat next to mine, and I put my hand briefly on hers and felt that her hands were not shaking. The finance analyst Angela had brought in presented the account documentation. Systematic redirection of Rachel's salary into accounts she'd been gradually removed from over 6 years. The forensic accountant used the word coercive and watched the jury's faces as it landed. The hotel records were submitted, the pattern of deception. A former colleague of my son-in-law's, a woman he'd worked with for 2 years before she'd quit, testified about things she'd witnessed. A conversation she'd overheard. A voicemail he'd left Rachel from the office that she'd played once, not understanding what she was hearing, and which had stayed with her. He did not testify in his own defense. The jury took 4 hours. Guilty. Domestic battery. Coercive financial control. The judge, a woman of around 60 with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the patient expression of someone who has heard every version of this story, sentenced him to 18 months, suspended after 6, with 5 years of supervised probation, mandatory completion of a batterer's intervention program, and full financial restitution to Rachel for the accounts he'd depleted. The restraining order was permanent, unless both parties petitioned to modify it. He would also pay child support, a relevant detail because Rachel had told me 2 weeks before the trial that she was pregnant. 12 weeks. The timing of it, she'd said, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands around a mug, was either terrible or meaningful depending on how you looked at it. She'd decided to look at it as meaningful. When the gavel came down, Rachel exhaled. Not a sob, not a breakdown, just a long, complete breath, like a door finally closing. Her friend put an arm around her. I sat very still and looked at the man who had spent 8 years erasing my daughter, being led from the courtroom by a bailiff. And I noted that I felt nothing toward him that resembled hatred. Hatred requires sustained attention. He didn't deserve that. Afterward, we went to a restaurant near the courthouse, all 3 of us, and ordered too much food, and ate most of it. And the friend told a story about something that had happened at her office that had nothing to do with any of this. And Rachel laughed. A real laugh. The kind she'd had before. The kind that took over her whole face. I watched her and I thought about her mother, who had died before seeing this. Who would have had something pointed and elegant to say about everything that had happened, as she always did. And who would have been here for this meal, reaching across the table to touch her daughter's face. She did it, I thought, in the direction of wherever that conversation goes. She's all right. The divorce finalized on a Tuesday in February, handled by mail after her husband's lawyer sent the papers without contest. The financial settlement returned what had been taken. Rachel got the house, which she promptly sold, and used the money to put a down payment on something smaller in a neighborhood she'd picked for herself, close to her school, close to a good park, the kind of practical, independent decision she hadn't been allowed to make for 8 years. On the day the sale closed, she called me from the driveway of the new house. "It's yellow," she said, with a note of amused disbelief. "I don't know what I was thinking. It's very yellow. Your mother would have loved it." A brief silence. "Yeah," she said softly. "She would have." By spring, her friend from Austin had come for a long weekend, and they'd painted 2 of the rooms. I'd come over to help, and instead had been handed a roller, and given a section of the living room wall and a specific shade called morning fog that my son-in-law apparently would never have permitted in his living room, because it wasn't a neutral color. Morning fog turned out to be a kind of soft blue that made the room feel like exactly what it was called. I stood back after finishing my section and found that I liked it unreasonably much. Rachel's baby, my granddaughter, arrived in August. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She came out looking like she had opinions about the whole enterprise, which seemed right. Rachel named her after her mother. I drove to the hospital before sunrise, the same way I'd driven to a hospital with Rachel 9 months before. And when I was allowed into the room, Rachel was sitting up in the bed with this new small person in her arms, and she looked at me over the baby's head with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, some combination of exhaustion and wonder and absolute certainty. "Come meet her, Dad," she said. I sat next to the bed. The baby opened her eyes, which were the color that all babies' eyes are at the start, dark and ancient and unclassifiable. She looked at me with the complete openness of someone who has no information yet about what the world will ask of her. I thought about all the things I would tell her when she was old enough to hear them. About her grandmother, who had been funny and fierce and smarter than anyone she'd ever meet. About her mother, who had walked through something that would have destroyed a lesser person and had come out walking straight. About the yellow house. About morning fog blue. About the difference between hesitation and patience, between love and fear, between looking away and standing still. "She looks like you," I said to Rachel. "She looks like Mom," Rachel said. Same thing. Rachel laughed, then winced, then laughed again. We stayed like that for a while. Outside the hospital window, the Dallas morning was coming in on the kind of August day the city does, where the heat is already present even before the sun has fully committed. Delivery trucks on the street below, a shift change visible through the window of the building across the way. The ordinary, enormous movement of the world. 13 months after that October night, when my phone lit up in the dark, Rachel came to my house for Sunday dinner with the baby in a car seat and her friend visiting again from Austin and my brother and his wife who'd driven in from Fort Worth. 7 of us at a table, designed for 6. The baby on Rachel's lap, being passed around at intervals, generating the specific chaos that infants generate in a room full of adults who want to hold them. After dinner, while my brother and his wife did the dishes over Rachel's protests, and her friend had taken the baby into the backyard to walk her around in the evening air, Rachel and I sat at the kitchen table with coffee. She'd come back to herself. That was the only way I knew to say it. The woman sitting across from me was recognizable as the one I'd raised, the one who'd told me I was embarrassing her at her wedding and meant it affectionately, the one who'd argued with me about everything from college majors to parking tickets and had usually been right. There was something additional now, something that hadn't been there before, not exactly. A quality of knowing her own weight, of being acquainted with what she was made of. "I've been thinking about going back for that master's degree," she said. "Yeah?" "Special education focus. I've had 3 students in the past 2 years who needed support I wasn't fully equipped to give." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "I want to be equipped." "Tell me the timeline," she smiled. This was language from her childhood, my way of asking her to make the plan concrete, and she'd resented it then and had come around to it later. She told me the timeline. It was practical and well considered, and she'd already spoken to the department chair at the university. She'd thought it through with the same careful competence she'd apparently always had and had been told, for 8 years, to defer to someone else's judgment. "What does it cost?" I said. "Dad, that's not a question, either." She looked at me steadily. Then, "I'll send you the information." From the backyard, through the window, I could hear her friend talking to the baby in the particularly earnest voice that adults use with infants, narrating the yard in full detail. as though the baby required a guided tour. Rachel's face as she heard this, the particular warmth that comes from watching people you love in the act of loving each other. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, still looking toward the window. "Okay." I blamed myself for a long time, for not seeing it sooner, for not leaving when I first noticed things were wrong, for making you all go through what you went through, because I stayed. "Rachel, let me finish." She turned back to me. I thought about it a lot in therapy, and what I understand now is that I was doing what I'd been taught to do: accommodate, explain, give the benefit of the doubt. Those are good instincts in normal circumstances. He used them against me. A pause. It wasn't weakness. It was the wrong tools for the wrong situation. I was quiet, but here's what I actually wanted to say. Her voice steadied. "That night when I pulled up to your house, I sat in the car for 10 minutes before I called. Because I was still scared. Scared you'd tell me it wasn't that bad, that I was exaggerating, that I should go home and try harder." She held my eyes. And then I thought, not him, not my dad. And I called. The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of my brother washing dishes in the next room and the baby being introduced to the concept of a garden hose. "I didn't deserve that certainty," I said. "Not after the times I hadn't listened." "No," she agreed. "But you'd earned it back." She picked up her mug. "You put that uniform on, and you did it right. No vigilante nonsense. No making it about your ego. You documented everything. You took me to the hospital first. You worked through the system." A faint smile. 30 years of training, turns out, was good for something other than paperwork. The paperwork was always good. She left. Actually left. From the backyard, the baby made a sound of what appeared to be interest, and we both turned to look through the window at this small person held in my daughter's friend's arms, examining the world with the complete focused attention of someone to whom everything is still new, everything still possible. I thought about the garment bag in my study, about 30 years of other people's daughters and sons coming home broken and deciding to keep going. About the morning 9 months ago when I'd stood in front of a window in an old uniform and seen someone I recognized looking back. About my daughter at 7 years old, standing on my feet in the living room, insisting she could dance. She'd been right. She always had been. Outside, the evening was settling over the neighborhood in shades of gold and ordinary blue. The sky doing the thing it does in Texas at the end of summer, offering light it doesn't technically owe you, beautiful for no particular reason. The baby had fallen asleep against Rachel's friend's shoulder. Through the screen door I could hear Rachel's voice, soft and low, talking to them both, and under it the specific quiet of a house that is being rebuilt from the inside out, one evening at a time. I sat at my kitchen table and drank my coffee. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything I should have been fighting for years before I finally did, and I was going to spend the rest of my life making sure she knew it had been worth every minute of the waiting, every hard step of the coming back. My daughter was free. The rest was just time.